Good day. A couple of days ago, I reported on this channel information that the important village of Kleshcheyevka, southwest of Bakhmut, had been captured by the fighters of the Wagner organization. This was provoked by a flurry of reports from the battlefields, the first actually from a Czech volunteer fighter, contractor, mercenary, call him whatever you like, who was actually fighting with the Ukrainians and who said that that is to say, the Ukrainians have lost control of Kleshcheyevka. And there were more reports to that effect from various other sources over the course of that same day when that Czech fighter gave that report. Then the following day, we had a denial from Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner group, the Wagner organization, whose fighters carried out the assault on Soledar and whose fighters were also involved in the assault in Kleshcheyevka. Prigozhin said that the reports that Kleshcheyevka had been captured were premature. He was very critical of some of the people who were reporting that Kleshcheyevka had been captured. He said that these reports of its premature capture were putting the lives of some of his fighters in jeopardy. Though I don't quite understand how or in what way. But anyway, never mind. Well, after Prigozhin said that, I did a program in which I reported Prigozhin's comment, and I said that when Prigozhin makes those kind of claims, that usually is a sign that a particular place, in this case Kleshcheyevka, is indeed in the process of being captured. When he makes these sort of qualified denials, that actually means that the battle for the place in question, in this case Kleshcheyevka, is almost at an end. He did exactly the same in terms of the fighting in Soledar. And I may as well say that I think that the reason Prigozhin does this is not because the early reports about the capture by the fighters of the Wagner organization of Kleshcheyevka were actually wrong in any substantive or fundamental way. It is that he likes to be the person who comes forward and reports the fact of the capture of any particular place, and he doesn't like it when other people get ahead and report it before he does. Well, sure enough, today he has confirmed that Kleshcheyevka has indeed been captured. And I've discussed the importance of Kleshcheyevka in previous programs. It is between Opytnoye, the town, the village that sits astride the main road leading into Bakhmut from the south, and Kleshcheyevka is to the west of Opytnoye and is on the way to another village or settlement or small town called Ivanovka. The Russians, by the way, call it Krasnoye. All these places seem to have different names, but we won't get into the details of that. I will continue to refer to it as Ivanovka for the time being. And of course, Ivanovka also sits astride another main road leading into Bakhmut, this time from the west. And in order to capture Ivanovka, the Russians needed to gain control and to consolidate control of Opytnoye and Kleshcheyevka. Well, they now control Opytnoye, they control Kleshcheyevka, and again, within the last few minutes, just before this program began to be made, I saw reports, whose accuracy, of course, I cannot confirm, that there is now actual fighting going on in Ivanovka itself. In other words, Russian forces, Wagner organization assault troops, have now reached Ivanovka and are fighting for control of that particular settlement. Now, as I said previously, if Ivanovka falls, and if the Russians are able to consolidate control of Ivanovka, all the main roads leading into Bakhmut from various different directions will have essentially been cut. And at that point, we are in a position to talk about a cauldron or an emerging cauldron for the Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut itself. By the way, on that topic, I've received a very erudite email from someone, and by the way, another email from another person, both of whom say that the expression cauldron is wrong. It is in fact a kettle, a boiler. The correct word is boiler, not cauldron, and apparently it comes from German, Kessel, and it was in fact an expression first coined by the Germans, presumably at some point during the World Wars. Well, I stand corrected. I will refer to it as a boiler in future. The idea is that you encircle the troops there and then you gradually heat up the boiler until eventually the troops either surrender or are basically eliminated in the brutal way in which this war is conducted. Anyway, we're not quite in a boiler situation in Bakhmut yet, but it seems to be getting closer. One could almost say by the hour, though I'm not going to try and guess how many hours or days or perhaps even weeks we are before we finally arrive there. But anyway, there is now no doubt at all that the Russians control Opitnoye to the south of Bakhmut and Kleshcheyevka to the southwest of Bakhmut, and that they of course also control Solidar to the northeast of Bakhmut. And there's also information, by the way, that the Russians have now broken into the other important village or settlement north of Bakhmut, Krasnaya Gora, and of course that sits astride the road from Bakhmut to Siversk, and it's likely that that road is to all intents and purposes now unusable. So a deteriorating situation, a steadily deteriorating situation for Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut, this area where Ukraine appears to have concentrated a huge part of its army. Now, I'm going to say straight away that its fighting goes on all across the front lines. It's not necessarily all in one direction. There was a report yesterday that the Ukrainians have mounted a strong counterattack in the Kupiansk area and have recaptured a part of the large village or small town of Novomikhalovka, which the Russians had captured a few weeks ago. Still apparently fighting going on there, and for the moment it seems that neither side is in full control of this town, but it seems that the Ukrainians have recovered the greater part of it. What the Russians are going to do about that, we will see. And there's also reports that the Ukrainians are planning some kind of offensive in the Vuhledar area. There's apparently been a large concentration of Ukrainian troops around Vuhledar, and of course there's talk that they might be planning some kind of offensive in this particular part of the battlefronts. And again, there was apparently an increase in the fighting yesterday and the day before. However, elsewhere, things are also going badly for the Ukrainians, and these are in other important areas of the battlefronts. The Russians, or to be more precise, the authorities of the Donetsk People's Republic, are claiming that their forces are pushing successfully northward from Vodyanoye, another settlement close to Donetsk city, and that the Russian forces are now creeping ever more closely towards Avdiivka, and that, well, the encirclement of Avdiivka is not in sight in any immediate term, but it's perhaps getting incrementally and steadily closer. Anyway, that's the situation on the battlefields. Now, I ought to also say that I've been seeing reports this morning of air raid alerts all across Ukraine. I haven't heard any reports so far about further Russian missile or drone attacks. Perhaps they're on the way, perhaps not. If and when they are, I will discuss it probably in my next program. Meanwhile, there's been reports, which of course I'm not able to confirm, but they're coming from plenty of sources now, primarily, I should say, Ukrainian sources. The General Zaluzhny, the Ukrainian chief of staff, is now urgently asking President Zelensky to withdraw Ukrainian troops from Siversk. Apparently, he's telling President Zelensky that with the fall of Soledar, with the imminent capture by the Russians of several further settlements to the north of Soledar, with the road to Bakhmut cut, with the likelihood, once these other settlements are captured, that more roads to Siversk will be cut, and with the Ukrainian troops in Siversk having the Siversky Donetsk River at their back, well, General Zaluzhny has apparently told President Zelensky that Siversk is undefendable, and that if the fighting there continues, if the Ukrainian troops in Siversk are not withdrawn soon, then they could also find themselves in a boiler. We're not talking, obviously, about the numbers of troops that there are in Bakhmut, but nonetheless, one doesn't want, presumably, one's soldiers to be trapped in a boiler. Well, it seems that, as is always the case, President Zelensky, whose government, by the way, still does not admit the fall of Soledar, more than a week now, almost 2 weeks now since, more than a week now since that happened. Anyway, he is very, very reluctant, apparently, to countenance this withdrawal from Soledar, from Siversk, even though General Zaluzhny is apparently assuring him that Siversk has lost its strategic importance, which again begs the question of why, in that case, Ukraine spent so much time defending it in the first place. But, again, I'm not going to go into that discussion. So, overall, we can see that the situation on the battle lines is getting very difficult for Ukraine, and no doubt that it's going to continue to be the case for the next couple of days, probably weeks, with a very strong likelihood now that Ukraine will either have to withdraw from Bakhmut and Siversk, or if it doesn't, that it seriously risks the entrapment of its troops in both of these towns effectively in a boiler, and the collapse of the so-called Zelensky line, and all kinds of other mounting problems for the Ukrainian military in the Donbass fronts. Well, even as all of this is going on, there have been lots of comments from various important Russian officials. The most important of all, President Putin, has been on a trip to St. Petersburg, where he met and had a very lengthy discussion with veterans of the siege of Leningrad, as St. Petersburg was then called, in the Second World War. This is one of the great and deeply tragic events of the Second World War, insufficiently known about in the West. Something like 1 million people died defending Leningrad, as it was then called, which had at one time become encircled by the Germans. There was widespread starvation in the city, and eventually the siege was broken, and of course Leningrad never fell. And Dmitry Shostakovich, the famous Soviet-Russian composer, wrote a symphony, his seventh symphony, to commemorate the resistance of the city in the face of that siege. If you want to visit a particularly moving location in Russia, by the way, the cemetery near St. Petersburg, where hundreds of thousands of people who died in the siege are buried, is an extremely powerful experience. Anyway, to move on, Putin was there. He also visited the Obukhov plant. This is one of the oldest industrial plants in Russia. It's very much part of the military industrial complex. Once upon a time, in the Tsarist era, it made guns, built big 12-inch guns for the Imperial Russian Navy. Today, it is part of the Almaz-Antey missile air defense complex, the people who make the surface-to-air missiles and air defense systems for which Russia is famous. Anyway, Putin visited the Obukhov plant and made various comments, apparently, while he was there. Now, interestingly, in this instance, the Kremlin website doesn't seem to be reporting much of what Putin actually said. Most of the report of Putin's visit at the Obukhov plant involved his meeting with workers at the plant. There are many questions to ask on social questions, on material benefits, on indexations of wages, and that kind of thing. And Putin was there, and he just talked about this at very considerable length. And of course, it's important to say that in Russia, and of course for the people who work at this plant, these kind of discussions are important. But the Kremlin, for whatever reason, at least so far as I can find, is not reporting some of his other comments, Putin's other comments, which I have seen in other places, other parts of the Russian media, including, by the way, the TASS news agency, which is, of course, Russia's official news agency. And I suspect the reason for that is because Putin touched on the ultra-secret topic of military production. And he said that all industrial plants are now working at very high levels of intensity. In fact, one of the workers at the Obukhov plant even said that they're working at the same level of intensity that they did during the early 5-year plans that the Soviet Union launched in the 1930s. Well, who knows how valid or not that comparison is. But Putin did say that Russia produces more surface-to-air missiles than the rest of the world combined, which, by the way, I believe is true. He also said, perhaps not entirely consistently with that Russia produces a third more missiles than the United States does. Again, I've no way of verifying these figures. And he seemed to have, overall, a pretty confident view about the increase in production of the defense industries. He was, by the way, over the course of his visit, very careful to point out as well that military factories like the Obukhov plant should dedicate at least 30% of their production to the needs of the civilian economy, which is, by the way, repeats a practice that was already prevalent in Soviet times. Well, that was Putin, and he's, by the way, since that time followed up with another meeting with his government officials reviewing Russia's economic performance last year. He says that GDP contraction was 2.5%, points out that when the sanctions were first imposed, there were quite a few people who were expecting that the contraction would be around 20%. The 2.5% contraction is actually lower than what the Russian authorities themselves were predicting only a few weeks ago, when they thought it might be in the region of 3%, 2.9%, I seem to remember, was the accepted figure. Well, it was actually 2.5%. Inflation is continuing to fall. It's below, the annualized rate is now below 12%, and is actually falling. The actual rate of price growth is significantly below that, at somewhere around 5 to 7%. All this is according to Putin. And he seemed to feel that the dynamics in the economy were good, that every part of the economy was now coming back on stream. When he was visiting the Obukhov factory, he was talking about how Russia has all the industrial and technological resources to fill any important gaps in its economy caused by the sanctions. So that was Putin. The other person who spoke at length yesterday was Sergei Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister. And he held a very long press conference, a big press conference at the foreign ministry. I think it's a press conference in which he was reviewing the events of 2022. Now, unfortunately, I don't yet have a complete transcript of what Lavrov said. The Russian foreign ministry is often slow in publishing transcripts. But one point he did make is that the latest conflict in which Russia finds itself in is in some ways a repeat of other conflicts that have happened in the past. He spoke about situations where France under Napoleon, Germany in the 1940s, other countries in the past have united the whole of Europe and then led them into a conflict with Russia, at which point everything falls apart for them. And Lavrov said that this was what was happening now was simply another example, another case of this. Lavrov also appears to have been at pains to make it clear that the conflict in Ukraine did not start on the 24th of February 2022. It has been an ongoing conflict that really began from the moment of the overthrow of President Yanukovych, his government in Ukraine in February 2014. Everything that has happened since has inexorably followed from that fact. And lastly, he went on to say that he didn't see any realistic prospects at the moment for negotiations with the Ukrainians, because what the Ukrainians were saying was incoherent and made no sense. And from his point of view, he couldn't see that there was any basis to talk with the Ukrainians at all. So that was Lavrov. Now, it may be that he said other things, more interesting things. If so, I will return to them. I will return to this press conference in another video once the full transcript appears. And then lastly, another senior Russian official had his own things to say, and that was the Russian Prime Minister Mishustin. And he is reported to have said that there is now a deadline, that the Russian military in the conflict zone must be provided with all that it needs, all the equipment, supplies, everything that it needs by February. I'm not sure exactly when in February, but anyway, that's what Mishustin said. So clearly there is a major effort underway to resupply, to provide these supplies to the Russian military. I'm assuming Mishustin said this over the course of a meeting of the Coordinating Council that is intended to mobilize assistance for the military within the Russian economy. And of course, that does beg the question of what are all of these supplies intended for? So that's, anyway, what Mishustin had to say. And all of this is going on hand in hand and at the same time that we've had major exercises now beginning in Belarus, and including aviation exercises, aircraft. We've seen pictures of MiG-31 fighter jets taking off from Belarusian airfields. And of course, that's also making people increasingly nervous. And we know that these exercises are going to continue into February. I would say that for the moment, all the statements of Russian and Belarusian officials who are discussing this major build-up in Belarus, all of them are agreed that it is not intended for any offensive purpose against Ukraine. It is intended to secure and defend Belarus from any challenge or threat from the West. Anyway, that's the Russian side of things. Now, yesterday, we also got reports from Ukraine, they're not reports, they're facts, that the Ukrainian Interior Minister and the entirety of the team, practically the entirety of the team, the top leadership team of the Ukrainian Interior Ministry, were killed in a helicopter crash in the Ukrainian town of Bovery. And, well, there's been ever since massive amount of discussion and speculation, both about the implications of this and about how it came about. Now, let me talk first about how it came about, because there seem to be two theories as to the proximate cause of this crash. Theory one, which is the official Ukrainian government theory, is that the helicopter crashed because of a pilot error. Theory two is that the helicopter was shot down by a surface-to-air missile, a man-portable surface-to-air missile. Most, in fact, all of the reports I've seen speculate that it was an American Stinger missile, but there's conflicting views as to why this missile was launched against this particular helicopter. There's some suggestions that it was an error, that Ukraine's very nervous and edgy air defense shot down this helicopter by mistake, under presumably the impression that it was Russian. But there's also inevitably perhaps claims and theories that it was some kind of an assassination. Now, I'm going to say straight away that I do not know what the truth is. I don't have the ability to assess a helicopter crash. I've seen no official report yet. I simply don't know what actually happened to this particular helicopter. There are some questions. There's one question, which so far as I'm aware, nobody is asking, which is why were all of these important people present in this helicopter? Why specifically have so many of the top officials of the Interior Ministry flying in a helicopter in the middle of a war? What was so important as to bring them together in this way? Surely you would want to disperse the top people of your Interior Ministry, either amongst several helicopters. Perhaps Ukraine doesn't have several helicopters, or perhaps you would send them driving to Bovery from Kiev or whatever it is, send them there by some other means. You wouldn't, or so one would assume, want to have all of these people together in one helicopter. Now, I say that it has happened before. There have been instances in Russia where helicopters have crashed with a large number of top officials in them. I seem to remember that something like that happened a few years ago in the Far East, with a whole group of important military officials killed over the course of that particular crash. But of course that happened in peacetime, and one can just about understand, or so it seems to me, that there wouldn't be concerns or excessive concerns about piling all of these people into one helicopter and flying them somewhere. One might not anticipate an accident. Well, in wartime, surely one ought to be taking more precautions to protect the leadership team of one of one's most important ministries. Anyway, I asked the question because I straightforwardly don't know the answer to it. I don't know why all of these people were in one helicopter at the same time, a helicopter which crashed with the consequences we all see. Now, as to whether the helicopter crashed, as I said, whether it was human error, pilot error, or something else, a missile, the only thing that I can say about that is this. Apparently there's been eyewitness reports of the crash of the helicopter, and those who seem to have more knowledge of this sort of thing than I do, or claim to, are saying that these reports from these eyewitnesses are not consistent with pilot error. They speak of a helicopter flying normally and then suddenly falling, which is not what you would expect with pilot error. Now, I'm not sure whether these eyewitness claims are backed by film. If they are purely eyewitness claims, then I have to say I wouldn't place much weight in them, because my experience in assessing witness evidence is that eyewitness evidence of this sort is almost invariably very unreliable. And anyway, I'm not going to go further than this, but for the record, those reports do exist. If you want to place weight on them, which perhaps you should, I'm not saying one shouldn't, but if you want to place weight on them, they do seem to point more to a missile than to pilot error. But as I said, I personally wouldn't place too much weight on these reports, eyewitness reports, unless they're actually backed by film, which shows this precise thing happening. Of course, when there is a proper investigation of the crash site, assuming there is a proper investigation of the crash site, which might be a big assumption, by the way, well, perhaps that situation will be further clarified and we'll know an awful lot more. But anyway, for the moment, the only evidence that I am aware of, factual evidence, is these reports that the helicopter just fell. And as I said, that doesn't sound like human error. But as I said, I'm not sure how strong that evidence is. Now, if this was not a human error and the missile was shot down, was it an accident or was it deliberate? Well, again, I don't think we can know, but I'm going to make a guess that in that kind of situation, it seems to me far more likely that it was an accident than anything else. In other words, somebody with a missile made a mistake, thought it was a Russian helicopter and shot it down. I say that, though the helicopter in question was not apparently a Russian manufacture, it was not an Mi-8, it was a Western helicopter. And it does seem surprising that a Ukrainian soldier would mistake it for a Russian helicopter, because even I, who am not particularly versed in these things, can tell pretty much immediately when a helicopter is a Western manufacture and when it is former Soviet or Russian. But anyway, the fact is there's been many recorded cases over the course of this war of Ukrainian air defense making mistakes, and it seems to me much more plausible and most likely is that this would have been a case of that if this helicopter was indeed shot down by a missile. Having said that, this is Ukraine. It is a country where there has been a well-known corruption problem. It is a country which is racked by violence. It's in the middle of a war. One can't exclude the possibility of an assassination. I'm not saying it was, but who knows? Now, if it was an assassination, who might have done it? Well, one possibility, of course, is that it was done by the Russians. Though the Russians have shown up to now no particular inclination to attack senior officials of the Ukrainian government, and this would mark a fundamental change in policy which would have had to have been authorized at the very highest level, including, I suspect, by Putin himself. But one can't, it seems to me, fully exclude the Russians. And I say that because of the people involved. Now, the Interior Ministry in Ukraine controls the police forces, it controls the internal security forces. It's not, however, as I understand it, in charge of the intelligence and counterintelligence agencies of the Ukrainian state. I believe, for example, that the SBU is not is not directly subordinated to the Interior Ministry. But I may be wrong about this. But anyway, nonetheless, it is an important ministry controlling large numbers of internal security forces, which of course is an important line of defense, not just for the Ukrainian state, but for the Ukrainian government. And of course it does also control the police. So it could be that this is partly that it's partly intended to weaken the Ukrainian state. It's also possible, and I have seen this suggested, that the Interior Minister and his officials were engaging in various corruption investigations, some of which might have affected certain senior Ukrainian officials, and that this was why the helicopter was shot down. Who knows? There's even been one particular theory that I've seen circulating, that this assassination is part of some kind of purge, and that it is somehow connected with the summary dismissal of Alexei Arestovich, President Zelensky's former spin doctor, who got sacked a few days ago after he contradicted the official narrative about the missile that crashed or allegedly crashed into the apartment building in Dnipro. Well, I'm going to have to say this. I don't think we have anywhere near enough information to build on any of these theories. I wish I could say that we will one day get the truth of this and that there will be a proper investigation and that we will find out what actually happened. But to be absolutely frank, I think that is extremely unlikely. I think that whatever result the investigation that's going to be carried out into this affair comes up with, it's simply not going to be one that's going to satisfy most people, because from any and every point of view for Ukraine, this has been a deeply embarrassing incident. The fact that such an important official and so many of his most important subordinates were killed means that Ukraine is not going to be happy about whatever result an investigation produces, whatever the proximate cause of this accident. Now, what overall effect will it have on the war and on the situation in Ukraine? I'm going to be straightforward here. I'm going to say that I don't think it's going to have any. I think that though this is an important person, no doubt, and that the staff of his ministry were important people as well, I think that the Ukrainian government retains a sufficiency of tools within Ukraine to maintain control of the country. And I don't think that we should see this event, even if it was an assassination, which from the Ukrainian government's point of view would be the worst possible explanation for this event. I don't think that the death of these people is going to shake the Ukrainian government's control. So I'm afraid those who are hoping that I can come up with some great enlightening explanation of what happened are going to be disappointed, because it seems to me that overall we just don't have enough facts. But I want to say again, I would want to warn against any over high expectations that this is going to change anything dramatically in Ukraine or about the war. Now, since we are on the topic of the war and returning to that particular topic, we have now had a meeting in Davos. Davos, the World Economic Forum, is convening. All sorts of the great and the good, or perhaps the great and the not so good, are gathered there. There's, by the way, apparently, according to Zero Hedge, a large number of people who've been coming to provide services, very personal services, to many of the people who attend this meeting. Again, I'm choosing my words a bit carefully, but I think you can all guess what I mean. Anyway, they're all there. They've all been in Davos. Kissinger, Boris Johnson, all sorts of people like that. Olaf Scholz, they've all been talking in Davos. And the mantra that's been coming out is that in order to win peace in Ukraine and indeed in Europe, the West must unite to help Ukraine win. There's some vagueness as to what victory actually means in terms of Ukraine, and certainly very little understanding or discussion of what that victory actually would achieve. But anyway, there's been lots of talk and discussion about the fact, in fact, it's been, if you like, the mantra that everybody who has attended Davos has been obliged to follow, that this is the ritualistic phrase that has been spoken about all of the time. And of course that papers over some cracks, because it seems that Olaf Scholz and President Biden of the United States had a rather acrimonious telephone call. Scholz apparently told Biden that he was not prepared to authorize the transfer of Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine, either from German arsenals or from those of Germany's allies, unless the United States agreed to supply Abrams tanks to Ukraine. And by the way, I understand that the correct pronunciation of the name of that tank is Abrams, and can I apologize to Americans for my mispronunciation of the name of that tank? I've had some rather acerbic emails pointing out that I'm not pronouncing it correctly. I'm pronouncing it in an English way, and of course this is an American tank, and I apologize for that. Well, apparently Biden flatly said that the United States would not supply Abrams tanks to Ukraine, in which case Scholz fired back that in that case Germany would not be supplying Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine either, which would suggest, or might appear to suggest, that the two are cancelling each other out, and that Ukraine isn't going to get either Abrams tanks or Leopard 2 tanks. Well, I wouldn't be too sure. Like Brian Beletic at the New Atlas, I think that when the military people meet in Ramstein on Friday, this is a monthly meeting of the NATO defense ministers to talk about the situation in Ukraine, there's going to be an enormous pressure on the Germans to change their position about the Leopard 2 tanks. The Poles are in effect blackmailing the Germans by saying that if the Germans don't agree to release Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine, Poland will just send some of its own anyway, paying no attention to what the Germans say. So, they're trying to put that kind of pressure on the Germans. I personally would be extremely surprised if on Friday and over the course of the next few days, a decision is not made to provide Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine. Can I say this has been a consistent theme of this conflict? The Western powers, Germany especially, rules out certain things, says that it's inconceivable that we would ever agree to do certain things, be it sanctions against, sanctions that would involve disconnection of Russian banks from SWIFT, cut off of energy flows from Russia to Europe, supplies of heavy weapons to Russia. The Germans always say this, and then they come under pressure, and invariably, up to now, they fold. And I've no reason to think that this is going to change on this occasion. This despite the fact that there are now more and more complaints from the German military about this whole policy. And I'd like to thank those people from Germany who have provided me with the text of another interview by another German general, General A.D. Harald Kuyat, who says that he was the chairman of the NATO-Russia Council and the NATO-Ukraine Commission of Chiefs of Defense, and who makes it absolutely clear that he thinks that the whole policy of the Western powers, which has led to this Ukrainian war, is wrong. And he also makes it very clear that he is opposed to the delivery of Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine. I'm going to discuss General Kuyat's interview and some other interviews about tanks in my next video. I think I've said an awful lot about tanks over the last few days. I think I'm going to take a rest from that today. But what I will say is this. It may come as a surprise to most people, but I don't think that Davos actually was particularly focused on Ukraine this year. EU officials remain fixated on the topic of Ukraine, but I think that increasingly the worry of European leaders is not Ukraine as such, but the fact that the United States government under President Biden is now, through its misnamed Inflation Reduction Act, providing a massive subsidy to their domestic industry, and the Europeans are increasingly seeing that as a protectionist measure directed against themselves. And apparently Chancellor Scholz complained about this at Davos and talked about the real possibility of a trade war between Europe and the United States. Well, I'm not going to discuss that in this program. What I am going to discuss instead is a rather interesting article that's appeared in the Daily Telegraph, which I agree with entirely. But before I do that, I'm going to say, to provide some measure of context, that in my opinion, Davos, the WEF, is fading. I think that 10, 15 years ago, even 5 years ago, it was a big event. The really important people from around the world congregated and attended it and wanted to speak at it. Today, its power, its global reach is much diminished and is fading away all the time. And one of the reasons it is fading, it is losing its traction, is because its home institution, the European Union, is fading as well. Fading not so much in the grip that it has over European countries, but in its global power. And this is what the European, what this article in the Daily Telegraph is all about. And about it, I fully agree. Now, this article in the Daily Telegraph is about the decline of Europe as an economic bloc, its increasing fall into global irrelevance. And on that, by the way, I agree. Now, I should say I'm not going to read the entire article because it is behind a paywall, but I will read extracts from it, and I should say its title is Brussels' Power as a Trading Bloc is Fading Fast, and it's by Matthew Lynn, who, by the way, takes an implacably hard line on Russia and is a strong supporter of Ukraine. But anyway, he says the EU's impotence against Joe Biden's protectionism shows its influence is waning. And he then says that the European Union's advocates claim it is the world's regulatory superpower. They argue that sheer size of its market means that no one can ignore it, and its negotiating skills mean that it can steamroller other countries into accepting its terms. The EU makes a big deal of its influence in the world. Its heft and weight is sold as one of the key benefits of membership. But then Matthew Lynn discusses how Scholz threatened a full-scale trade war with the US, joining a chorus of complaints from European leaders. And then the result was nothing. The US simply shrugged it off and possibly hasn't even noticed. And it's true. I don't read the American media. I don't get the impression that they're intimidated by all these voices coming out of Europe, threatening trade wars or anything like that at all. And Lynn goes on to say there is an important lesson in that. The EU's power as a trade bloc is fading fast. A few officials in Brussels might still think it matters, but to everyone else it is increasingly irrelevant. And then he discusses the nature of Biden's Inflation Reduction Act. I'm not going to get into its details and the various steps that the United States has taken to bolster its industries. But then he does make a number of very valid points about the EU's place in the world. He says one of the major arguments that Remainers in Britain never tire of making is that the EU is the world's dominant trading bloc. It made the rules that everyone had to follow. It had the weight to negotiate any deal it wanted, because the single market was so huge and so important that no one could ignore it. Perhaps once upon a time that was actually true. In 1980, the EU by itself accounted for 30% of global GDP. It is now down to just 15%. Now, I think these two sentences need to be qualified. In 1980, it was not the EU. I believe at that time it was still the European Economic Community. It later became the European Community, and then, of course, it became the European Union. But I think in 1980 it was still the European Economic Community. And, of course, its composition was different then from what it is today. In 1980, Britain was a member, but the states of Central and Eastern Europe, the former communist states of Central and Eastern Europe, had not yet joined. They were still very much in 1980 under the Soviet yoke. So, things were different then. But overall, I think he's absolutely right. I think in 1980, the EU was an economic, what became the EU was an economic colossus. Remember, at that time, it was the big West European economies, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, and Britain. It's still all of those economies, minus, of course, Britain, which, however, is also a declining economy, perhaps an even more rapidly declining economy. And, of course, it didn't have all of the East European states, which joined it later. And at that time, it did account for 30% of global GDP. Today, it is only 15% of GDP. And then Lynn goes on to say, measured by total output, it is smaller than the US, and as of last year, it is smaller than China as well. But the US, well, I'm not going to discuss that in this interview, in this video. But then Lynn goes on to say, its key industries such as semiconductors, it accounted for more than 30% of global output at the start of the century. In around 2000, it is now down to less than 10%. On any measure you care to look at, it is sinking into irrelevance, as of course is the United Kingdom in terms of global economic influence. That's Matthew Lynn speaking, so he admits that Britain is also in decline. This is partly because China, much of Asia, at least half of Africa, indeed the US as well, have all been growing much faster. And it is partly because its overbearing regulatory system and the massive size of its welfare bill have slowed down its leading companies to such an extent that they can barely compete on the global stage anymore. Whatever the explanation, the result is the same. A market that accounted for a third of global GDP mattered to everyone, but one accounting for 1/8 and getting smaller with every year that passes, not so much. A few officials in Brussels might still imagine it is a regulatory and trade superpower, able to order about other countries and demand changes whenever it needs them. The evidence tells us that in reality it has little influence left, and no matter how many threats it makes, no one will pay any attention. Well, Lynn does overstate his case. I'm going to say that straight away. I mean, the EU is still a major economic bloc. But he is right about the overall trajectory of travel. And he is also right about the extent to which this is not understood. This change, this lack of power, this loss of power, economic power, is not fully understood at the top of the EU itself, or indeed in Berlin and Paris and these other places. And to my mind, this is at the heart of what went wrong in 2022 over the Ukraine conflict, which is the main topic of this program. The EU imagined that it vastly exceeded in economic power Russia, and that it had the power to force the rest of the world, coerce the rest of the world, alongside the United States, to do what it wanted over Russia as well. And the result is that it overestimated the power of its sanctions policies against Russia. It assumed that freezing Russian central bank assets would cause the Russian economy to implode. And then when it didn't, it assumed that the sanctions it took against Russia's energy industry would also cause the Russian economy to implode. I can remember that this was also the view expressed in the United States. Before the fighting began in February last year, I remember a briefing in the White House by an anonymous senior administration official, Jake Sullivan, possibly, saying that Russia was a one-dimensional economy that was in a symbiotic energy relationship with the EU. It would have to supply its energy to the EU in order to survive economically, so there was no real risk that Russia itself would cut the energy flow off. Well, things have turned out otherwise, but one can see why the EU and the United States, assuming that there was still this titanic economic bloc, might first of all impose freezes, stop purchases of Russian oil and Russian gas, and then look on in astonishment when the Russians found other customers, unable to imagine that such a thing would happen, and then overestimating again their own power, their regulatory reach, the strength of their insurance companies, that they think that they can impose price caps on Russian energy products, and then find to their astonishment that, again, the rest of the world ignores them. When Matthew Lynn talks about how the United States shrugs its shoulders at threats from the EU about possible trade wars, isn't it more accurate, perhaps more interesting, to talk about how Russia and the rest of the world has shrugged its shoulders in the face of the sanctions that the EU, hugely overestimating its own economic strength, imposed upon Russia? Anyway, coming back to the WEF. The WEF began way back in the 60s as an institution founded, in my opinion, by old money, old European money, dedicated to European integration. It is symbiotically tied up with the EU. As the EU fades in power, so does the WEF. Big Chinese business interests stayed away this time, as apparently did the Russians, and before long, most of the world will do so too. Anyway, that's where I finish today. I hope this has been another useful video. More from me soon, and we'll see what the military developments are on the ground. And by the way, we'll also keep an eye on what goes on in Ramstein when the German and other defense ministers of the NATO bloc meet and decide what to do about tank and other military deliveries. So I'll be keeping a track on that, and as I said, that's coming soon. In the meantime, it only remains for me to thank you again for joining me for this program, and to remind you that you can find all our videos on our various other platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram, and that you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video, and also that you can you should check out our shop and see the great things that we have there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all those great things. Last but not least, please remember to tick the like button if you've liked this video, and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again. More from me soon.